33 people. That is the number of lives she saved before she was dragged to the pyre. Records from coastal South Carolina plantations tell the story of an enslaved woman whose healing abilities became legendary across 3 counties, until the very families she had cured eventually turned against her. On the morning of August 14, 1748, the iron door of the Georgetown District Jail was opened by guards who came to retrieve the condemned healer for her execution. The cell was empty. No broken locks, no escape tunnel, no accomplice, she was simply gone. Local authorities ordered the incident stricken from all official records. For nearly 3 centuries, her story lay buried in sealed church archives and private family journals. Tonight, you will hear the true events concerning the woman they labeled a witch, and the reasons why her disappearance instilled greater fear in the entire community than any execution ever could. Before we delve into the account of the healer who disappeared from a locked cell, if you are captivated by historical mysteries that challenge established notions of American history, be sure to subscribe and enable notifications so you never miss a tale like this. Also, let me know in the comments, what state are you listening from? I love hearing where my audience discovers these forgotten narratives. Now, let's journey back to 1731, to a place where survival hinged on recognizing the fine line between having a gift and carrying a curse. Although the Georgetown magistrates attempted to erase the official record, they could not silence the whispered accounts that survived in family Bibles, ledger margins, and letters tucked within old books. It is from these fragments that we reconstruct the truth of what transpired. The community that would later become Georgetown was situated like a gem on the Winnew Bay, where 4 rivers met to form one of the Atlantic coast's finest natural harbors. By 1731, the cultivation of rice had transformed the low country into an engineered landscape of canals and vast plantations stretching miles inland. The air was heavy with humidity, mosquitoes, and money, all equally relentless. The Fairmont plantation encompassed nearly 800 acres of prime tidal land. Its rice fields were laid out in a precise geometric pattern that would have impressed any European engineer. The main residence, constructed from durable cypress and tabby, a distinctive mix of oyster shells, sand, and lime, stood 2 stories high with expansive piazzas designed to capture the slightest breeze. Inside, imported English furniture was complemented by pieces crafted by skilled enslaved carpenters, whose names would never be recorded. Jonathan Fairmont, 29, had inherited the property, including 63 enslaved individuals whose financial value surpassed that of the land itself. Educated at the College of William and Mary, he possessed the typical mix of ambition and insecurity of a second son from a wealthy lineage. His wife, Catherine, was 16 at the time of their marriage, the daughter of a Charleston merchant who profited from the triangular trade. She had very pale skin that easily burned in the Carolina sun and suffered from a persistent cough that the local physician dismissed as a weak constitution. The enslaved people at Fairmont lived in 2 rows of small cabins positioned behind the main house, close enough for quick summons but distant enough for maintaining propriety. Their days were spent working the rice fields, back-breaking labor in water up to their thighs, under a sun capable of killing a person in hours. At night, they tended their own small gardens, preserved their own customs, and performed their own quiet acts of resistance. Sarah arrived in the early spring of 1731, sold from a Virginia plantation following her previous owner's death. Her bill of sale estimated her age at 25, listed her condition as healthy, and her skills as domestic work. It failed to mention the small leather pouch she wore around her neck or the unquantifiable knowledge she carried. She was tall for a woman of that era, with hands that moved with peculiar precision when handling plants. Her eyes held a quality that made people uneasy, not defiance, but an unsettling level of observation, as if she perceived more than the visible surface. She spoke little during those initial weeks, learning the rhythms of Fairmont, the rulers, and the small tyrannies and greater cruelties that structured every day. It was a field worker named Thomas, whose legs bore never fully healed shackle scars, who was the first to experience her abilities. He had severely cut his hand on an oyster shell while fixing a trunk gate controlling the rice field water flow. The wound festered in the heat, turning angrily red, then black at the edges. The overseer, a Scotsman named Duncan McCleisich, logged the injury but offered no aid. Though a dead slave was costly, so was a doctor's visit. Thomas showed Sarah the wound one evening after the work bell. She inspected it silently, then vanished into the woods behind the slave quarters. An hour later, she returned with a handful of plants that looked like common weeds to anyone else. She used a flat stone to crush certain leaves into a paste, mixed it with well water, and bound the mixture to his injury with cloth strips. Within 3 days, the black coloring had receded. Within a week, the wound was closed. Within 2 weeks, Thomas could hold an axe without pain. The news spread rapidly through the quarters, as crucial information always did, through glances, casual conversation, and the careful code the enslaved used to safeguard what mattered. Others sought her help with their ailments: a woman with a post-childbirth fever, a child with an unrelenting cough, an elderly man whose swollen joints made walking agonizing. Sarah treated them all, typically at night and in silence. She never requested payment, for what could they offer? Nonetheless, recipients left small gifts: a carved spoon, a handful of reserved rice, a scrap of blue fabric. The main house first noticed her in July when the overseer, McCleasich, developed a severe stomach ailment that left him bedridden. For 2 days, he writhed in pain while his assistant dispatched a messenger for the Georgetown doctor, who was miles away attending a difficult birth. A house slave named Betty, who had observed Sarah's work, quietly suggested to Catherine Fairmont that perhaps Sarah possessed healing knowledge. Catherine, desperate as her husband grew increasingly infuriated by the lack of plantation supervision, agreed. Sarah examined the overseer with her characteristic careful attention. His symptoms suggested food poisoning combined with the brackish water from the rice field well. She prepared a tea from the bark of specific trees and roots dug from specific forest spots, monitoring his recovery while making him drink it 3 times daily. Within 4 days, McCleasich was back on his horse, issuing orders. Jonathan Fairmont recorded the event in his ledger. The slave woman Sarah has demonstrated knowledge of herbal remedies, proved useful with overseer's illness, may serve household purposes. Catherine's persistent cough worsened throughout the late summer. What began as a mild irritation became a persistent, racking cough that shook her thin frame. Dr. Archibald Hayes of Georgetown prescribed bleeding, then purging, then an invention of his own that cost Jonathan $/text, pound, $3 sterling and was completely ineffective. By September, Catherine was gravely ill, barely leaving her bed. She was so thin that her collarbones sharply protruded beneath her nightgown, and she coughed blood into handkerchiefs that the house slaves secretly burned. Jonathan grew frantic, his worry expressing itself as irritation toward everyone. Betty suggested Sarah again. This time, Jonathan himself summoned the healer to the main house. Sarah stood in Catherine's bedroom doorway, her observant eyes taking in everything: the windows kept shut despite the heat, the smell of infection, the pale, damp skin, and the shallow, rapid breathing. She stepped closer, placing her hand on Catherine's forehead. Then her chest, then her back, searching for something imperceptible. "She needs air," Sarah stated. Her voice was surprisingly clear, with an accent suggesting northern origins. "Clean air, and the windows must open." The physician said drafts would worsen her condition, Jonathan protested. Sarah looked at him directly, a moment of eye contact that would have earned most enslaved people a beating. "The physician is wrong." Perhaps it was desperation, or perhaps Sarah's certainty, but Jonathan ordered the windows opened. Sarah returned that evening with bundles of plants. She boiled water in the kitchen, an act that shocked the cook in charge, and steeped leaves and roots in careful proportions. The resulting tea smelled of mint and something sharp, almost medicinal. She ensured Catherine drank it 3 times daily. She also mixed a paste to be rubbed on Catherine's chest and back before sleep. Most importantly, she insisted Catherine sit on the piazza for 2 hours each morning and evening, breathing the river air. Dr. Hayes declared this treatment dangerous superstition, warning Jonathan that he was risking his wife's life by following a slave's advice. But Catherine was dying under Hayes's care, so Jonathan continued Sarah's regimen. 3 weeks later, Catherine walked downstairs for dinner. 4 weeks later, her cough was reduced to an occasional clearing. 6 weeks later, she requested her sewing basket, a sure sign of renewed strength. The tale spread through Georgetown society with the speed of scandal. The Fairmont slave who saved Catherine's life became a frequent topic of discussion. Other plantation families began requesting her services, always discreetly and with the proper negotiations between owners, because a skilled slave's time was valuable property. Sarah treated Rebecca Thornton's infant son when he developed an intractable fever. She cured Samuel Hartwell's persistent headaches. She helped Ann Colleton's elderly mother survive the winter. She treated infected wounds, delivered babies, eased the suffering of the terminally ill, and turned away no one with a genuine need. The enslaved community observed this development with mixed feelings. Sarah's gifts brought her privileges: better food, a private room, exemption from field labor. However, gifts that made one valuable to white owners were also dangerous. Valuable property was tightly guarded and controlled, and property that became too important, too independent, or too confident in its own worth needed to be reminded of its place. Sarah kept meticulous records, though she couldn't write. She notched a small piece of wood for each person she treated, marking whether they were enslaved or free, and whether they lived or died. By her count, she had successfully treated 33 people by the spring of 1748. The 34th would change everything. The 34th person was Benjamin, Jonathan Fairmont's only son, born in 1743. Adored and indulged, the boy was the center of his parents' lives and the future of the Fairmont plantation. He was 5 years old when he developed a fever in April 1748. Sarah examined him with her usual care. The fever was high but not critical, and the symptoms suggested a common childhood illness she had seen countless times. She prepared her remedies: fever-reducing tea, cool compresses, and specific herbs to protect his lungs. She instructed Betty on the exact treatment schedule. However, a panicked Jonathan also summoned Dr. Hayes. The physician arrived the next morning, examined Benjamin, and prescribed his standard treatment: bleeding to release the bad humors. When Sarah learned of this, she objected, finding Jonathan in his study and speaking with urgent impertinence. "The bleeding will weaken him. He needs his strength to fight the fever. Please, continue my treatment. 3 more days and he will recover." Dr. Hayes, overhearing the exchange, was incensed. "You dare question my medical judgment? I studied at Edinburgh University. And you, a slave woman with some hedge-witch knowledge of weeds, presume to countermand my professional opinion?" The confrontation intensified. Dr. Hayes demanded that Jonathan choose either his educated treatment or Sarah's plantation superstitions, but not both. To reject Hayes's advice in favor of Sarah's remedies would be a public insult to a respected physician, a slight no gentleman could tolerate. Jonathan chose Dr. Hayes. He ordered Sarah back to the quarters and forbade her from entering the main house. Dr. Hayes bled Benjamin twice over the next 2 days. The boy grew weaker, his fever spiking. On the 3rd day, a rash appeared, which Hayes interpreted as the expulsion of bad humors. On the 4th day, Benjamin could not keep down water. On the 5th day, he died. Catherine's screams echoed across the plantation. Jonathan drank heavily in his study. Dr. Hayes examined the body, declared the death was due to a malignant fever beyond any treatment's reach, and collected his fee before leaving. In the slave quarters, Sarah wept for the child she was not allowed to save. The funeral occurred on a grey morning. Catherine was ghostly in black. Jonathan's face was a mask of rage searching for a target. 3 days after Benjamin's burial, the target emerged. The accusation began quietly, like poison in the water. Dr. Hayes, during a dinner at the Thornton plantation, casually mentioned the peculiar effectiveness of the slave Sarah's remedies. "Almost unnatural," he mused, swirling his wine. "One wonders what exactly is in those concoctions." Rebecca Thornton, whose infant son Sarah had saved, felt a chill. What if Sarah's healing wasn't medicine, but something darker? Nobody had ever actually witnessed what Sarah put into her teas and pastes. The whispers spread through Georgetown society like a fever. Sarah's remedies were too effective to be simple herbalism. There must be something else, some secret knowledge, some pact or power that exceeded normal human ability. And if she could heal so effectively, couldn't she also harm? Hadn't Benjamin Fairmont died only after Sarah's treatment was stopped? What if her remedies had created a dependency, a corruption that made him vulnerable once they were withdrawn? What if Sarah had been slowly poisoning him all along? Theological implications were debated in every parlor. South Carolina had no history of witch trials like Massachusetts, but the colonists knew the stories. They believed Satan worked through human agents, often choosing the most vulnerable women, servants, slaves, to do his bidding. Wasn't it suspicious that a slave woman possessed knowledge surpassing trained physicians? Where else could such knowledge come from but a supernatural source? Jonathan Fairmont, consumed by grief and fury, seized upon these whispers. His son was dead, someone had to be responsible. If Sarah's healing had always been devilish rather than divine, she had been corrupting his household for 17 years. Perhaps Catherine's recovery had been a false, temporary reprieve granted by dark powers to earn their trust. On May 3, 1748, Jonathan filed a formal complaint with the Georgetown magistrate, accusing Sarah of practicing witchcraft, using diabolical arts and poisonous substances, and deliberately causing his son's death through supernatural means. The trial. The charge was legally dubious. South Carolina had no witchcraft statutes and generally discouraged such prosecutions as primitive. However, the magistrate, a wealthy planter who had lost 2 slaves to mysterious illnesses the previous year, agreed to investigate. Sarah was arrested on May 5 at dawn. 3 men, led by the overseer McCleisich, found her in her cabin, awake and grinding herbs. They removed and searched the leather pouch around her neck, finding dried leaves, small roots, a piece of quartz crystal, and a small handwritten book filled with notes and drawings of plants. "She can write," McCleisich exclaimed, genuinely shocked. Literacy among enslaved people was illegal, punishable by whipping. But that transgression paled next to the witchcraft charge. The book, written in a mix of English and an unrecognized language, was presented as evidence of her occult knowledge. They took her to Georgetown in shackles and locked her in the new brick jail, which featured 3 cells with iron doors. The trial, if it could be called that, took place over 2 days in late May. Dr. Hayes testified that Sarah's remedies violated natural law. Rebecca Thornton testified that Sarah had always seemed uncanny. Other witnesses came forward. Sarah had once predicted an illness before symptoms appeared, she had found water during a drought, she had correctly predicted a child would be born with a defect. Each story, innocent alone, built a portrait of someone with superhuman knowledge. Sarah was not allowed to testify against white citizens. However, the magistrate, troubled by the irregular nature of the proceedings, asked if she had anything to say. She stood in the courtroom and spoke clearly. "I learned healing from my mother, who learned from her mother. Every plant has properties. Every illness has patterns. I watch, I remember, I learn. There's no magic in it, only attention and care." "Then explain," the magistrate pressed, "how you knew Rebecca Thornton's child would survive when 3 physicians said he would die." Sarah met his gaze steadily. The physicians were draining his blood when he needed fluids. They were closing the windows when he needed air. They were treating their theories instead of watching the actual child. "I watched. I saw. I acted. The child lived because I paid attention to what was real instead of what I'd been taught." The courtroom murmured at this near insolence. Dr. Hayes looked furious. The verdict was swift: guilty of practicing witchcraft and causing death through supernatural means. The sentence, handed down on May 28, was death by burning at dawn. On June 1, Catherine Fairmont took to her bed and would not speak. Jonathan drank, assuring himself that justice had been served. The enslaved community at Fairmont whispered prayers and fears. In her cell, Sarah calculated her chances of survival. The jailkeeper was Hosea Jenkins, 43, who supplemented his government pay by running a small business. He was not cruel, nor was he particularly compassionate. Prisoners were his job. Sarah was his only current prisoner. He brought her food twice daily. He rarely spoke, except to announce when he was opening the door. But on the evening of May 29, 2 days before the scheduled execution, Jenkins found Sarah sitting cross-legged, eyes closed, her lips moving. When he set down her food, she opened her eyes. "Your daughter suffers from headaches," she said. Jenkins froze. His daughter Martha, 11, did suffer terrible, debilitating headaches. But he had told no one in Georgetown. "How do you know about Martha? You have lines around your eyes that come from worry, not age. You carry the smell of feverfew. You've been trying to treat someone with it, but feverfew alone won't help if the headaches come from pressure in the skull. You need willow bark tea mixed with feverfew, given at the onset of pain, and she should sleep with her head elevated on 2 pillows. You're about to burn for witchcraft and you're giving me medical advice," Jenkins stammered. "I'm about to burn for healing people," Sarah corrected. There's a difference. That night, Jenkins prepared the tea exactly as Sarah instructed. When Martha's headache began the next morning, he administered the tea and elevated her head. Within an hour, the pain subsided instead of building. By afternoon, Martha was playing. Jenkins spent the evening wrestling with his conscience. The law mandated Sarah's burning. The court had ruled. Yet, the law had also labeled the healing of his daughter's pain as witchcraft. If that was the case, the law itself was flawed. He made a decision that would cost him everything. On the evening of May 31st, after darkness fell, Jenkins visited Sarah's cell. "I'm going to unlock this door," he whispered. "In 10 minutes, I'll be in my office facing away from the cells, examining ledgers that require my complete attention. What happens after that is between you and God." Sarah stood. "They'll know you helped. They'll suspect," he replied. "They won't prove it. I'm a free man. They can't torture a confession out of me. And I'll have a plausible story about falling asleep at my desk." He paused. "My Martha is 11 years old. Before you treated her, she spent half her life in pain. That's worth my job, maybe more. Where should I go?" "North. Follow the river inland away from the plantations. There are places in the backcountry where nobody asks questions, where people need healing and don't care where it comes from. You'll find help if you're careful." He gave her a small bundle, food, a knife, and flint. "It's all I can spare." Just when we expected the story to end at the stake, one man's conscience altered everything. If you are gripped by this account of courage and impossible choices, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this video with someone who loves true historical mysteries. And drop a comment with your theory. Do you think Sarah made it to freedom, or did they catch her before dawn? Let's discover what happened next together. At midnight on June 1st, Sarah exited her cell. She moved through the darkened jail like smoke. Jenkins sat at his desk, his back to the cells, hands slightly trembling as he pretended to review supply ledgers by candlelight. She paused at his door. "Thank you," she said softly. He didn't turn around. "Go." Sarah vanished into the Carolina night. Dawn arrived precisely at 5:47 a.m. on June 1st, 1748. The execution was scheduled for 6 a.m. When Jenkins reached the cell to escort Sarah to the pyre in the courthouse square, he played his role with convincing shock. "She's gone. The prisoner has escaped." The magistrate was summoned. Jonathan Fairmont arrived within minutes. Dr. Hayes came to observe and offer medical expertise in case of injury during the search. Half of Georgetown's free populace gathered to witness the scandal. The cell was thoroughly examined. The lock showed no signs of tampering because it had been opened with a key. The iron door hung correctly. The window, a narrow slit, remained barred. There was no tunnel, no loosened stones. She had simply vanished. A whisper spread through the crowd, vanished like smoke, like a demon summoned back to hell. A search party, led by the overseer McCleasich, found no tracks or broken branches. "Witchcraft," Dr. Hayes pronounced. "Clear evidence that our judgment was correct. Only supernatural powers could accomplish such an escape." The magistrate, personally inspecting the cell, pondered a different question. If she could vanish through witchcraft, why wait until the night before the execution? No one had a satisfactory answer. Jonathan Fairmont offered a reward of $text, pound, $50 sterling for Sarah's capture, a massive sum. Bounty hunters arrived, specializing in tracking escaped slaves through the swamp and forest, but they found nothing for 2 weeks. At the Fairmont plantation, unsettling events began to occur. Nothing overtly supernatural, but things that felt like more than coincidence. The rice crop failed in one section of fields. McCleasich investigated and found the trunk gates sabotaged, allowing salt water to flood the paddies at the wrong time. Someone with knowledge of rice cultivation had done it intentionally. A fire started in a storage barn, destroying the season's seed rice. The cause was undetermined, but the burn pattern suggested multiple simultaneous ignition points. Horses went lame. Tools disappeared. Each incident could be an accident or negligence, but together, they felt like revenge. The enslaved community performed their work with careful neutrality, showing neither satisfaction nor concern. But at night in the quarters, they sang songs that had not been heard in years, old songs about tricksters and freedom, about those who escaped bondage through cunning. Jonathan began drinking more heavily. Catherine retreated into silence. The plantation began a steady decline. Dr. Hayes published a pamphlet, an account of witchcraft in the Carolina Low Country, which sold briskly. He made no mention of being wrong about Benjamin's treatment or that Sarah's remedies had been more effective than his own. In Georgetown, the jail lock was changed. Jenkins was questioned extensively but maintained his story. He had dozed off, and the cell was empty. Must have been witchcraft, just like everyone said. The magistrate disbelieved him but could not prove otherwise. Jenkins kept his job, though his reputation never fully recovered. His daughter Martha's headaches, however, remained manageable for the rest of her life. 2 months after the escape, a traveling merchant mentioned hearing tales from the backcountry of a woman healer who had settled near a Cherokee trading path, treating both colonists and Native Americans with equal skill. She was described as tall, with observant eyes and hands that moved with peculiar precision when working with plants. The magistrate's inquiries were met with no cooperation. The backcountry had different rules, and a skilled healer, regardless of her legal status, was too valuable to surrender. The truth about Sarah's escape remained hidden until 1779, when Hosea Jenkins lay dying of the summer fever. With death imminent and conscience weighing heavily, he summoned his pastor, Reverend Samuel Blackwell, and made a confession. "I let her go," he said, his voice weak but clear. "I opened the cell and gave her supplies and directions. She didn't vanish through witchcraft. She walked out through an unlocked door while I pretended not to notice." The pastor was shocked. "You allowed a convicted witch to escape." "I allowed a healer who saved my daughter's life to avoid execution for the crime of being better at medicine than the men who charge money for it," Jenkins coughed. "She wasn't a witch. She was a woman who paid attention to the world and learned from it. We burned her because she made educated men feel inadequate, and because she was enslaved and couldn't be allowed to possess knowledge that exceeded her masters." Jenkins had more to confess. In his fever-weakened state, 30 years of guilt poured out. Sarah hadn't been entirely alone in her preparations. During her month in jail, she had one regular visitor besides Jenkins, a free black woman named Phyllis Rutherford, who operated a small bakery and supplied the courthouse and jail. Phyllis was one of the few free people of color in the district, her freedom purchased years earlier by a grateful merchant whose life she had saved through skilled nursing during a yellow fever outbreak. Phyllis had known Sarah before the arrest. Her freedom, bought years earlier by a grateful merchant whose life she had saved through skilled nursing during a yellow fever outbreak, allowed Phyllis to help. Phyllis had known Sarah before the arrest. Years prior, Sarah had aided Phyllis's sister through a difficult childbirth on a neighboring plantation. The baby was breached, and the white midwife had given up, pronouncing both mother and child lost. Sarah had been summoned as a final desperate measure. With careful, patient manipulation over 8 hours, she had successfully turned and delivered the baby alive. The mother also survived. Phyllis never forgot this. When Sarah was incarcerated, Phyllis began visiting the jail under the guise of delivering fresh bread, an unnecessary expenditure she claimed was Christian charity for the condemned. She would sit outside Sarah's cell and read scripture aloud, which was considered proper. Within these readings, however, she embedded vital information. Names of safe houses. Descriptions of landmarks along escape routes. Warnings about roads with patrol stations. Jenkins had been aware of these communications but chose ignorance. His duty was to secure prisoners, not monitor every word spoken through the bars. When he made the decision to unlock Sarah's cell, he knew she wasn't walking into a complete void. Phyllis had already mapped the path. But there was more to the escape. In the 2 days between Sarah's flight and Jenkins's official discovery of the empty cell, a conspiracy of silence had operated across Georgetown, one that was never fully recognized. The night watchman, who should have been patrolling the area, reported seeing nothing unusual. The merchant whose stable bordered the jail property did not hear when one of his horses was taken. A gentle mare, missing for 3 days, mysteriously returned. The ferryman at the river crossing north of town somehow failed to notice a tall woman crossing just before dawn. "We weren't all heartless," Jenkins whispered. "Some of us knew the trial was wrong. We couldn't stop it. The magistrate had decided." Dr. Hayes had testified. Jonathan Fairmont wanted blood. But we could choose not to see certain things. We could choose to be looking the wrong direction at the right moment. Reverend Blackwell asked the question that would haunt him: how many others were involved? Jenkins's answer was both specific and vague: count the people in Georgetown whose lives she saved, then count how many of them testified against her. The difference is your answer. Of the 33 people Sarah had successfully treated, only 3 had testified against her. 30 others remained silent, neither defending nor condemning her. But silence, Jenkins suggested, wasn't always cowardice. Sometimes, it was calculated restraint, the decision not to commit publicly so that later, if the opportunity arose, one could act without official consequence. Jenkins died that evening before naming more names. Reverend Blackwell was left with a confession implicating dozens of Georgetown citizens in a conspiracy to undermine a legal execution. He struggled with this knowledge. The Revolutionary War was in chaos in 1779, British forces controlled much of South Carolina, and Georgetown itself would change hands multiple times over the next 2 years. In the midst of such upheaval, prosecuting people for a 30-year-old act of mercy seemed absurd. It seemed like the very rigid adherence to law over justice that the revolution was supposedly fighting against. Blackwell made a defining decision for his ministry. He recorded Jenkins's confession in his private journal, but took no official action. He did, however, begin quietly investigating what had happened to the woman who escaped. This investigation led him to Phyllis Rutherford, now in her 60s and still running her bakery despite the war. When Blackwell mentioned Jenkins's deathbed confession, Phyllis studied him before saying, "Walk with me, Reverend." They walked along the riverfront. Phyllis spoke in a low voice about an unacknowledged network, a loose organization of free black people, sympathetic white citizens, and trusted enslaved individuals who helped move people to safety when the law became an instrument of injustice. "We didn't do it often," Phyllis said. Each escape made the next one harder. But sometimes a case was so clearly wrong that silence became impossible. Sarah was one of those cases. Phyllis revealed details Jenkins hadn't known. The escape route had been planned for 2 weeks before Jenkins made his decision. They had been waiting for him, or someone like him, to provide the opening. If Jenkins hadn't unlocked the door, they had found a blacksmith willing to forge a key. If that failed, they had identified a weak point in the brick jail wall that could be breached. One way or another, Sarah would not have burned. "You have to understand," Phyllis continued. By 1748, we'd all seen what happened when knowledge met fear. Sarah's crime wasn't witchcraft. It was competence. She made educated white men look incompetent. And worse, she did it while enslaved. That combination couldn't be tolerated. Burning her would set a devastating precedent, that any enslaved person with skills exceeding their station could be executed on supernatural charges. We couldn't allow that precedent. Reverend Blackwell asked the most important question: did she survive? Did she make it to freedom? Phyllis smiled but didn't answer directly. "I received a letter once, years after the escape. It came through Charleston, passed hand to hand until it reached me. No signature, no return address, but I knew the hand that wrote it. I'd seen Sarah's plant drawings, and the handwriting matched. The letter thanked me for the scripture readings that summer, said she'd found the passages particularly illuminating. That was all, but it was enough. This letter confirmed Sarah not only reached safety but had maintained her literacy, a dangerous thing for any black person in the South and evidence of remarkable determination. Phyllis provided rumors about Sarah's life after escape. "I heard stories over the years, rumors from travelers, talk of a black medicine woman in the backcountry who treated everyone equally: Cherokee, Creek, white settlers, escaped slaves, free black families. Some said she married a Cherokee trader. Others claimed she lived alone, independent, beholden to no one. The stories contradicted each other, which probably means at least some were true." Phyllis advised Blackwell, "The war will end eventually. When it does, we'll build something new, or try to. That new country will need to decide what kind of justice it wants. Your journal, Reverend, with Jenkins's confession and this conversation, keep it. Someday someone will need to know that even in dark times, some people chose mercy over law." That will matter more than you think. Blackwell followed her advice. The ripples of Sarah's case extended beyond Georgetown. In the years following her escape, South Carolina saw a notable decline in witchcraft accusations. This was partly due to Enlightenment influence, but Sarah's disappearance had shown the practical problems. If witches escaped supernaturally, trials were pointless. If they escaped through human aid, the social consensus needed for execution was lacking. Dr. Hayes's pamphlet, published in 1749, had the opposite of its intended effect. Instead of establishing him as a supernatural expert, it made him look credulous and superstitious. Educated readers in Charleston mocked his conclusions. A satirical response in the South Carolina Gazette in 1750 suggested Hayes's medical treatments were the real witchcraft, given how many patients survived by avoiding his care. Hayes's medical practice steadily declined, and by 1755, he had lost most of his wealthy patients. His career-ending lawsuit in 1763 was almost a relief, allowing him to retire rather than admit professional abandonment. At Fairmont Plantation, misfortune seemed to follow Jonathan Fairmont specifically. His enslaved workers did not run away, but they worked with a kind of deliberate inefficiency that was impossible to punish. Tools didn't go missing, they broke more often. Repairs were completed, but needed to be redone more frequently. Work was finished, but it took longer than before. The enslaved community had closed ranks, exhibiting quiet disengagement. They worked only hard enough to avoid punishment, and not a fraction more. In an economy dependent on their labor and investment, this quiet resistance was devastating. Catherine never fully recovered from Benjamin's death. She gradually realized that her son's death was the price of social convention and deference to credentialed authority over effective, practical results. In 1754, Catherine convinced Jonathan to free 3 of their slaves, an elderly couple and a carpenter. This was unprecedented for the Fairmonts, driven partly by Catherine's fragility and Jonathan's desperate hope that mercy might lift the atmosphere of quiet condemnation. It did not help. The remaining enslaved people viewed the manumission with careful neutrality, unimpressed by mercy that came 8 years too late. The final pieces of Sarah's story emerged decades later, through sources like Cherokee oral history. Sarah had renamed herself Rachel and arrived in Cherokee territory in late summer 1748, carried by a network of guides. She was exhausted, traumatized, and fiercely determined never to be property again. The Cherokee offered her shelter, as she proved extraordinarily useful. She successfully treated a respected elder's chronic joint pain. She learned Cherokee medical practices while sharing her own knowledge, engaging in a genuine trade between equals, a respect she had never experienced in colonial society. Rachel lived among the Cherokee for about 5 years, 1748 to 1753. She married another refugee, a mixed-race trader named William Crawford. They had no children, but Rachel helped deliver dozens of children in the backcountry. In 1753, William died in a hunting accident. Rachel chose to stay, building a cabin on unclaimed land. For the next 11 years until her death in 1764, she operated as an independent medical practitioner, treating all who came to her: Cherokee families, white settlers, escaped slaves, and free black families. She maintained her literacy and carefully recorded treatments and observations in a notebook that surfaced in 1856. The notebook reveals a mind that never stopped learning. An entry from 1758, treated white settler family today. Father called me and paid in smoked venison. Such simple respect still surprises me. I have been free for 10 years, yet I still expect orders and blows. Another entry, reflected today on the 33 lives I saved before they called me witch. I have saved at least 200 more since then. The medicine hasn't changed. My knowledge hasn't changed. Only my legal status and the color of my patient's desperation has changed. This tells me everything I need to know about which was real, the crime they accused me of or the crime they committed against me. Rachel's death in February 1764 was fittingly heroic. At approximately 60 years old, she traveled for 8 hours through a blizzard to reach a woman in premature labor, managing a complicated, life-threatening delivery. She successfully delivered a healthy baby girl, and the mother survived. Rachel, however, developed pneumonia and died 4 days later. Her last words were reportedly, "The baby lives. That's what matters." Over 100 people, Cherokee, white settlers, free black families, and enslaved individuals visiting relatives attended her burial. A young enslaved man named Isaac, who attended the funeral, later wrote to his brother, "I stood by her grave and saw people of 3 different colors weeping together. And I thought, if this woman could earn such respect from such different people, then surely the world is capable of more justice than we currently see." Historian Margaret Hensley's 1926 dissertation uncovered additional evidence. Phyllis Rutherford's will, died 1802, age 87, left a surprisingly large sum of money to establish a fund for the medical education of deserving persons, regardless of status or color. The fund was legally blocked but demonstrated Phyllis's intention to create access to medical knowledge. Hosea Jenkins's great-great-granddaughter, interviewed in 1924, preserved the family memory. She said Sarah just paid attention to things that doctors ignored. Sarah listened and helped. That was her crime, apparently, being too good at noticing. Hensley found recurring references in Southern records to enslaved healers using techniques that matched Sarah's methods, suggesting she was part of a broader, suppressed tradition of African and African American medical knowledge. The leather pouch taken from Sarah was eventually acquired by a medical student named William Drayton, later a physician, who studied its contents. Drayton wrote in his journal that Sarah's botanicals were remarkably effective and that she possessed knowledge that exceeded my expensive medical education. Hensley's work demonstrated that Sarah was a skilled medical practitioner, that her escape was aided by multiple people who recognized injustice, and that her influence persisted long after her death. In 1956, a historical marker was placed near the site of Rachel's cabin, honoring her. Although vandals destroyed it in 1965, the act sparked an effort to preserve the oral histories of backcountry medicine. In 2003, the Georgetown County Historical Society issued a formal statement acknowledging that Sarah's trial had been a miscarriage of justice and that her medical knowledge was genuine and valuable, representing a shift in how the community understood its past. Sarah's real legacy was not merely escaping the stake or living free, but every life she saved, every technique she documented, and every time someone chose mercy over law, healing over authority, and observation over assumption. That legacy endured for centuries, continuing to challenge the relationship between power, knowledge, and justice. What do you think of Sarah's story? Do you believe justice was ever truly served, or did she simply survive an injustice that was never properly addressed? The question of whether mercy is enough when justice fails remains relevant today. Would you like me to find out more about African American medical knowledge in the colonial South or the history of witchcraft accusations in the American colonies?